Think with me for just a moment about the word burnout. When you hear that word, what picture comes to your mind? Maybe you think about the dry, brown, arid grass you find in West Texas in July and August, where there just hasn't been any rain for some time and irrigation is not working well. The grass has gone from green and bright and with flowers to brown and dried up and arid. Maybe that's one thought you have. Or perhaps you think about a home that's caught fire and burned and is just a shell of its former self. I thought about this earlier this week when we heard the story about the apartment complex located in northwest Dallas, where 50-something people were driven out of their apartment living, their homes, because of a fire. And they immediately had to bring that building down and destroy it because of the danger. Well, those are pictures that we might think of with the word burnout. But when I think of this word, I think about a man or woman who is drained of energy, who feels tired, who feels used up, who feels stressed out. As my English teacher in high school used to say, and boy, this was burned into my memory, disgusted, busted, can't be trusted. She was a poet and didn't know it. But the reality is there are people that feel this way. And it may be that some of you are feeling stressed out, burned out, and because life today is challenging. We have a lot of things we have to deal with. And think of some of the people who typically feel burned out. Perhaps you think of the traveling executives, the type A's, who are road warriors, always on the go, here and there, and much to do, and no spare time. Or perhaps you think of missionaries who are facing all kinds of stresses, pressures from the society where they're ministering, pressures from financial shortfalls back home, and family issues. Maybe you're thinking about farmers. I remember speaking one time to a group of farmers while we were ministering in Nebraska, talking about the topic of farm family burnout. And I hadn't thought about farmers as burning out, but I found out as I talked with some of them afterward, and they resonated with what I had shared with them, they felt burned out because of the stresses. And I think about people in the Bible. Some of them felt burned out. Remember Moses and all the pressures that he had leading the children of Israel through the wilderness and putting up with their impatience and their frustration and dealing with the crises that came up from day to day. Now, I remember when Moses' father-in-law Jethro joined the crowd, he said, "These people are going to wear you out. You need to delegate some of what you're doing." Those are wise words for some of us today who want to do everything ourselves. And I think about, for example, Elijah dealing with the persecution of Jezebel and King Ahab and the prophets of Baal and how much pressure he felt there, and the time that he went out into the wilderness and prayed that God would take his life. He said, "I just don't think I can go on. I'm no better than my fathers." And God spoke to him and ministered to him there in the wilderness. I remember the disciples going out to minister, the Lord sending them out 2 by 2. And in Mark's gospel, they came back and they had literally been coming and going so much they didn't even have time to eat. And maybe some of you can relate to that today because of your hectic, frantic schedules. I think of Martha, who was busy getting ready to feed Jesus and his 12 disciples and her brother Lazarus and her sister Mary. And Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha was literally tied up in knots because she was trying to do so much. She came in, hands on her hips, at least that's how I envision her, saying, "Lord, tell my sister to get in here and help me get this dinner ready." And Jesus said, "Martha, Martha, you're troubled and anxious about many things, but one thing is necessary." Yes, there are people who are burned out today, executives, farmers, truck drivers, educators, many people today experiencing burnout. You think about the words of Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Let me read some verses for you here so that you can see how Solomon felt at one time. He said, "Therefore I hated life." This is verse 17 of Ecclesiastes 2. "Because of the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all this vanity chasing after the wind. Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I've shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor which I had done under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom and knowledge and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This is vanity and a great evil. For what has a man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity, emptiness, vexation of spirit, chasing after the wind. That's how Solomon felt, even with all of the many pursuits that he carried out and the accomplishments of his kingdom. What exactly is burnout? It's not a clinical term. You'll not find it in the DSM-5 or any of the medical journals. It's also not really a term that's found in the Bible. In fact, when I co-authored a book called How to Beat Burnout, I received a couple of notes from well-meaning believers who said, "Why would you write on a subject that's not even in the Bible?" And I thought that was a rather interesting critique. I wondered if some of them felt burned out. You know, the old story about if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, which one hollers? The hit dog, every time. And I thought maybe it hit home to them. Anyway, the word burnout is not in the Bible. I concede that. But the concept is. In fact, it's in the passage we just read together, found in Isaiah chapter 40, in the first part of the chapter. Verse 6, the voice said, "Cry out," and he said, "What shall I cry?" And this was the reply that came to the prophet. "All flesh is grass. Its loveliness is like the flower of the field. And what happens to the grass? The grass withers. The flower fades, because the breath or wind of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass." Carl Sandburg wrote a poem that some of you may be familiar with. The people, yes, the people, surely the people are grass. And basically what he says here, the grass withers, the flower fades. People get stressed out. People burn out. But the word of our God stands forever. And then we're going to find out some steps about beating burnout, overcoming burnout. But maybe first of all, we need to figure out exactly what burnout is. Several years ago, a psychologist named Krista Maslach wrote a book in which she talked about burnout, the high cost of caring. She particularly related it to the medical profession and other caring professions. And she identified three characteristics, and we identified these also in How to Beat Burnout. The first one is emotional exhaustion. You just feel drained, you feel used up. Now this is different from the kind of physical exhaustion that you often feel when you're exercising, when the endorphins are being stirred up. I have always enjoyed jogging and occasionally get out, don't do it as much anymore because of some breathing issues. But getting a good brisk walk in or a jog in, maybe you're doing exercises at the gym as Kathy and Karen do on occasion, and you're enjoying that, and when you get done, you feel tired. But it's a good tired. This is a different kind of tired. This is a kind of tired that you feel when you've just come to a place where you can't handle the emotions of life anymore. I remember a young mother of two very young babies telling me at one point she just didn't see how she could keep going. She had this responsibility of these babies, and what a challenge it was. We had years ago when I was managing a medical clinic, we had a lady there who was a nurse, and she worked on the hospital unit associated with the clinic. And she came in one day and said, "I'm just going to have to quit. I have to give this up. I can't handle it anymore. I'm just emotionally drained. I'm used up. These patients are just taking it out of me." That's one of the characteristics when you feel burned out. And people who are in education, people who are in ministry, people who run a business can very easily begin to feel this way. The second thing that happens when a person is burned out is they want to withdraw from people. They have what we call the 25-cent word for it is depersonalization. And it's just a fancy way of saying they want to withdraw from people. Years ago, I was working for a radio station and interviewing people, and one of the people I interviewed was a school bus driver. The school year had just started, and I asked him, I said, how do you like your work? He said, you know, he says, I have a brand new Bluebird bus. It has power steering, it has power brakes. And he said, the roads, they paved all the roads now. Some of them were dirt roads, gravel roads, and they've been paved. And I said, what about the children on your bus? How do you like them? He said, I hate every one of them. And I thought to myself, you know, what's the point of being a school bus driver if you can't stand the kids on the bus? Now, back when I was in high school, they did something really crazy in Alabama. They actually allowed some of the inmates to drive the buses. When I was a junior in high school, I was a substitute school bus driver. That surely wouldn't happen today. But I can recall some of the reasons why that school bus driver felt like the kids were his source of frustration. He wanted to withdraw from people. I remember a pastor, in fact, he was a pastor of my in-laws' church, and he would slip in during the last hymn before the message. He would preach the message and call on somebody to do the closing prayer, and he would slip out through the back door. And he was as unavailable as a pastor could be. And the reason was he was feeling burned out. The third thing that people feel when they're burned out, emotionally exhausted, they feel withdrawn from people, is I call it reduced accomplishment. This is like you're working harder and harder and accomplishing less and less. I really didn't understand this as well as I did after we moved to Kansas City and ministered there for several years. And then a short time after that, well, actually several years after that, we wound up in Nebraska for 8 years. And I discovered when it snows or when there's ice on the ground and you get stuck, and by the way, you do get stuck, it does happen. The answer to that is not to spin your tires faster and faster and faster. That's not the way to get out. In fact, if you spin your tires faster and faster, even in a mud hole in Texas when it's raining, you will just become more stuck. And yet, sometimes people, when they're burned out, feel if I just work a little harder, if I just get up a half hour earlier, if I just stay up an hour later, if I just quit taking a day off, if I just quit doing the things I enjoy doing, and just really put my nose to the grindstone, that doesn't cure burnout, it complicates burnout. It makes it worse. Well, we've talked about what burnout is, emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, reduced accomplishment. What causes burnout? I think if you took a clipboard and went down to the mall and talked to a dozen people or so, you'd probably have at least 8 or 9 of those people tell you they figured stress was the cause. And current stresses are a major factor in burnout. And it's interesting, this particular book, the book of Isaiah, the passage that we read today, was written against a backdrop when Israel was under great stress. They were under great stress because the Assyrians had come in and taken the 10 northern tribes captive. And because looming on the horizon was a group of people coming from Babylon. And they were about to invade the remaining tribes and carry the Israelites captive. Some of you recall back in the days when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Remember those days? It's been a while ago, but it's not that historical. And what a terribly stressful time it was. There have been some times in the history of Israel, back in the 1967 war and the 1973 war. And there's conflict going on there today. And I believe that people living in Israel today are facing great stress. But just imagine, these people in Israel in that day and time are literally facing the fact that many of their tribes and families have been taken captive and scattered to the four winds, and now the rest of them are facing that as well. So they're under great stress. And there are all kinds of different stresses that we face. Years ago, 2 psychologists, Holmes and Ray, developed a stress test where you get so many points. For example, the death of a spouse would be 100 points. A divorce would be 78 or 80 points. And the death of a close family member would be 75 or so points. And you'd have stresses for losing your job. You'd even have stresses for good things, like taking a vacation. So for those of you who are about to go on vacation, that can be stressful as well. Hate to tell you all that, Darla and Russell, but the reality is, and some of you know that because you just come back from spring break. And you found spring break to be not just the peaceful, tranquil time that you expected. So stresses are around. But in addition to the major hassles of life, an illness, for example, a diagnosis of cancer or some other serious disease, there are the minor life hassles. And a man named Richard Lazarus has written about those. This is what, when you lose your car keys, or when you forget something important on your calendar because you haven't looked at your calendar. Ever have that happen? Yeah, sure. We've all been there. Or maybe you're late getting your income tax return. Oh, I could have talked all day and not talked about that. April 15th is bearing down on us like a runaway freight train. And those things are stressful. And then conflicts are stressful. And of course, we have no conflict as a church. None of our families have conflicts. We don't have conflicts at work. Oh, wait a minute, what world am I living in? You see, those kinds of things are stressful, and they add to the stress that leads to burnout. But then there's a second factor we need to think about, and it affected the Israelites as well. And that's your personality, your type A personality, your obsessive-compulsive personality is the term that some of the psychologists like to use. And the Israelites had this as well. In fact, they were so committed to their religion that their religion was just going through the motions. Here's what the Lord said in Isaiah chapter 1 to them. Hear the word of the Lord. Give ear to the word of God. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord. I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or lambs or goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand to trample my courts? Bring no more futile sacrifices. Your incense is an abomination to me. The new moons, the Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity in the sacred meeting. God says, I am weary of bearing your appointed feasts. What's the point of all this? They were so into their religious activities, so into doing so many things to try to please God, that they weren't in any way having a relationship with God. Do you remember what the first thing was that I said is the important purpose of communion, of the Lord's table? In remembrance of Him, of the Lord Jesus. Yeah. And you see, these people had turned religion into an exercise that literally permeated their entire life. They were obsessed with it. They felt compelled to carry out this and that and the other religious activity, but it was empty of meaning, of just wearing them out. And so that particular kind of personality, and some of us don't have as much of that, and some of us have a lot of that. And we feel driven. We have to do this. We have to do that. We're a little perfectionistic. I won't ask you if any of you are. Don't raise your hands. But there's one problem with being a perfectionist. None of us is perfect. You see, you can be a perfectionist and not be perfect. And that creates a dissonance in our minds and in our hearts. We just aren't living up to that exacting standard. I think that was part of Martha's problem when she said, Lord, send your sister in to help me. And that leads us to the third factor, and this may be a surprise to some of you. We all understand stress and how driving on Central Expressway or the Bush Toll Road when it's blocked up with traffic, or even Highway 78. I was going home on Highway 78 on Friday afternoon at rush hour, and somebody had broken down with a trailer. And I called the KRLD traffic tip line, and they had so many accidents going on, they never got around to reporting that one. But there were an awful lot of people who were frustrated and stressed out with that. So stresses and personality type But here's the hidden root: bitterness and unresolved grudges. And I believe this may be a surprise to many people, but I think it's a key. You see, I think this is part of what Isaiah was getting at when he wrote in Isaiah 40, verse 27, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by my God?" You see, we can be bitter toward people because they've done us wrong. And oftentimes, our feeling is we don't want to get ahead, we just want to get what? Even. Yeah. And see, that's revenge. That's that revenge motive. And bitterness is anger that is preserved longer than it should be. Anybody remember what the Bible said, what the Apostle Paul said in Ephesians about dealing with anger? He said, "Be angry and sin not." The next thing he said was, "Let not the sun go down on your wrath." In other words, God wants us to deal with anger by bedtime. Can you imagine how many marital conflicts would be resolved if husbands and wives practiced dealing with their angry feelings toward each other by bedtime? Can you imagine how many disagreements in families would be resolved? I remember one instance where two sisters didn't speak to each other for literally between 3 and 4 years because of bitterness over the fact that one of them had gotten sick and the other one was sicker. And the one that had gotten sick was resentful because her sister had demanded more attention because her illness was more serious. You think I'm making this stuff up? I'm not. You see stuff in ministry that just will blow your mind. And these things happen. But bitterness leads to burnout, unresolved grudges. We'll tell you what it's like. You know, having a church cleanup day is a wonderful thing, and I'm so grateful for those of you who are a part of that. But can you imagine what it would be like if we only emptied the garbage once a year? Can you imagine what the garbage can would smell like? Yeah, it'd be pretty bad. In fact, can you imagine what it's like when you leave your garbage in and don't put it out the once or twice a week when the garbage man comes in your community? Yeah, it's pretty rank. It smells wretched. And you see, that's what happens when we allow anger and bitterness to build up. Somebody has done something or said something that's offended us, and we don't make it right. We don't go to that person. And if we've been the offender, we ask forgiveness. If we've been the offended one, we lovingly confront that person and share our feelings with that person. And we let that build up in our hearts and in our minds. And it basically becomes emotionally draining. And it's something that is a very real problem. And that's what the Israelites were feeling toward God. They're saying, our way is hidden from the Lord. You know what this would be like? This would be like people saying, you know, God answers prayer over in Rowlett. He's interested in those people. God takes care of the people in Levon and the people in Saxe and the people in Rockwall. But those people that live here in Wiley, it's like we're hidden from God. He doesn't see us. He doesn't know what's going on in our lives. Now, some of you live in Saxe and other places, but the reality in Rockwall. But the reality is, God does see and know what's going on in our lives. And God knew what was going on in the lives of these Israelites. In fact, to a great degree, their years and years and decades and even centuries of disobedience to God and even idol worship had led to the consequences they faced. But you see, they were blaming God. They were saying, God, you don't know what's going on. You don't see us. And furthermore, God, life isn't fair. Ever heard that one? My just claim is passed over by my God. That's verse 27 of Isaiah 40. God, life isn't fair. Life isn't just. Think of all those people whose big mansions and houses we drove past to get to church. And we have this little bitty house that doesn't have all the modern appliances. It doesn't have all of these nice things. Doesn't have a nice yard with somebody to keep up the landscaping, and doesn't have this and that. You see? And here we are driving a car that's paid for, but it's got hundreds of thousands of miles on it. And here's our neighbor driving a brand new German model SUV, and why in the world, Lord, don't you, it's not fair, Lord. That leads to burnout. And so oftentimes those feelings are there. Let me tell you a couple of illustrations that will help in understanding this. One is the illustration of the gunny sack. Just imagine that we passed out to everybody at church after the service today, after a little fellowship time for Mike and Viviana, that we passed out gunny sacks to everybody. And the rule is this: every time somebody does something to hurt you, to make you feel angry that week, you have to put either a rock or a brick or a concrete block, depending on the severity of the offense you suffered, in that gunny sack. And you have to carry that gunny sack everywhere you go. You have to move around with that gunny sack. You go to the bathroom, you can set it down, but you have to pick it up on your way out. When you go to sleep at night, you can lay it down, but if you wake up in the night, you have to get up and hold that gunny sack. Can you imagine how worn out you'd feel? I mean, that would be exhausting. That would be draining. That would just be miserable. And yet that's what it's like when we have unresolved anger issues. We have grudges, that bitterness that we've allowed to stay there. So that's one illustration. There's a second illustration, and that's peeling an onion. This is how you deal with it. What happens when you peel an onion? You peel one layer, and what do you find underneath that layer? Another layer, just like it. And what happens to your eyes while you're peeling an onion? You get tears, right? You cry. And if you have scratches on your hands, what happens there? There's pain, there's hurt, there's burning. And that's how it is when you're trying to deal with especially severe things like abuse from the past, childhood abuse, or family abuse, or maybe you've been treated unfairly at work, and all those feelings have built up and you have to deal with it. But you know what? If you keep dealing with it, if you keep turning it over to God, you keep turning it over to the Lord, eventually you get to the bottom of peeling the onion, and guess what? The onion's gone. That's what I want to encourage you to do. And that brings me to the third and final thing that we'll cover in just a couple of minutes. How to beat burnout. First of all, you start by changing your thinking. You have to change your thinking, first of all, about God. Look at verse 28. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, that's the Jehovah or Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God, the creator of the ends of the earth. You know, if he created the ends of the earth, he created everything in between. He doesn't faint. He's not weary. His understanding is unsearchable. That's the God that we serve. Oftentimes when we're burned out, we shrink God down to our size, and we redefine God. And we don't think about His greatness, His awesomeness, His power, His ability to do things, to take care of needs, to care for us in special ways. And then the second thing, we have to change our thinking about ourselves. We think, man, I've just got to try a little harder, just got to work a little harder. But notice the words in verse 29. He gives power to the weak. That word for weak has the idea of people that pass out from a lack of nourishment. To those who have no might, the powerless, that's a drop in concentration. You can't concentrate, you can't produce. To those he increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and grow weary. That word for weary has the idea of somebody who's just overstretched. It's like a rubber band or like elastic in some of your clothing that's been stretched to the point where it will no longer hold and work. And then he says, the young man shall utterly fall. That's a person who just has a real disaster, a crash and burn, an emotional blow-up, a moral failure, a physical collapse. But notice what the next statement is. Those who wait on the Lord shall what? Renew their strength. And here's where we appropriate His enablement. He gives power. He increases strength. But how do we get it? We learn to practice active waiting. Waiting on the Lord. Now there's one problem with this. Most of us think when we hear the word waiting about waiting on hold for somebody to answer a call, or waiting in a traffic jam for the traffic to clear. That's not what this word means. In fact, it's found in a family of words that mean to hope and to trust, and literally comes from a root word that means to stretch out. And so the idea is stretching out. In fact, baseball season started last week. Did you notice? Yeah, the Rangers are not off to a real good start, but hey, hope springs eternal. But just imagine you've gone to a baseball game and you're watching the first baseman, and there's a